You may not think of keys as anything extraordinary. They rattle at the bottom of your pocket, they clutter a dish by the door, and they dangle from hooks behind counters in hardware shops. They are pieces of bent metal, cut into grooves, designed only to turn, to click, and to give you access to what you already own. But keys carry a weight that is invisible. They represent safety, privacy, trust. And in a world that quietly depends on this invisible trust, one locksmith in a small industrial town discovered how easy it was to exploit. This story begins not with violence, but with something deceptively quiet. No guns, no gangs, no dramatic headlines. Just a man with a file, a set of blank keys, and a shop on a nondescript street. His name was Harold Benton. A locksmith's reputation. Benton wasn't remarkable at first glance. He kept a tidy shop in a Midwestern town that had seen better days. His window sign, painted in fading gold leaf, promised Benton's Locksmith Services, keys cut while you wait. For 2 decades, Harold was seen as part of the furniture of the town. Customers dropped in when they lost a key or needed a padlock for the shed. A locksmith is someone people rarely notice until something goes wrong. And in that way, Benton had the perfect disguise. He was the quiet man whose hands shaped the very notion of home security. Locksmiths, historically, were guardians of secrets. In the Victorian era, an English locksmith might be sworn to keep certain designs private, trusted not to share patterns that could compromise noble estates. Even in the United States, small-town locksmiths often had informal agreements with local police. They were considered extensions of public trust men who could be called in when a landlord needed to open an abandoned room, or when a sheriff required help entering a locked property. This trust was the shield that allowed Benton to build his quiet empire. The idea of selling twice. The crime began small, almost harmless. A customer would come in, flustered after misplacing a key. Benton would nod, make a duplicate, and send them on their way. But Benton had begun to notice a pattern. People often lost track of who had copies. Landlords misplaced extras. Families argued over spares. Businesses left boxes of old keys behind when they moved. The locksmith's insight was simple. If people were careless, if keys passed through dozens of hands, then one more copy could be made without anyone realizing. And if that copy were sold or passed along to someone else, who would ever know? At first, Benton's motives weren't clear. Was it greed? Was it curiosity? Or was it, as some later suggested, a dark fascination with power? A locksmith, after all, lives with the knowledge that every lock can be undone, every barrier is temporary. Benton began keeping duplicates of keys he cut. Not every key, just a few. A landlord's master key here, a shopkeeper's front door there. Small things. And in the locked drawer beneath his workbench, the collection grew. The first suspicion. The first person to grow suspicious wasn't the police. It was a tenant. Her name was Margaret Hinds, a schoolteacher who rented a flat above a bakery. One night she came home to find the door locked, but something felt different. The rug near the threshold was crooked. A drawer had been moved an inch. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just a whisper of intrusion. Margaret mentioned it casually to her landlord, who dismissed her concerns. The locks were fine, Benton himself had installed them. Still unsettled, she changed her habits, sliding a chair against the door, double-checking the latch. But weeks later it happened again. Always subtle, always without evidence. Margaret wasn't the type to accuse without proof, yet she noticed something. Each time she needed a spare key, she went to Benton's shop, and each time Benton asked with unusual precision about her schedule. When she taught, when she traveled, when she would be away. At the time, she chalked it up to small talk, but the questions lodged in her memory. The locksmith and the underworld. Word later spread that Benton wasn't simply hoarding duplicates. He was selling them. Not in the open, not across the counter, but through whispers in back alleys and taverns. Petty thieves, men who specialized in small-time burglary, found in him a valuable partner. Why risk breaking a window when you could slip in with a proper key? The deals were quiet. A man might pay a few dollars for a copy of a shop key. A young burglar might exchange favors for a duplicate to a landlord's storage room. Benton never advertised. He didn't have to. His reputation as reliable masked the shadows of his work. Investigators later pieced together a network. Benton knew which businesses closed early, which families vacationed, which landlords left apartments unoccupied. By selling duplicates, he didn't just provide access, he provided opportunity. The quiet spread of fear. For months, even years, the crimes that resulted from Benton's keys were brushed aside as coincidences. A bakery missing a few bags of flour, a tailor's shop missing some cash from a drawer, apartments rifled through, but with no signs of forced entry. Police reports described the intrusions as puzzling but minor. It was this very subtlety that allowed Benton to continue. His victims were often reluctant to pursue charges. After all, what was stolen was small, sometimes even intangible. Privacy, peace of mind, a sense of safety. The losses were quiet enough that they never demanded headlines. But in a town where people whispered, patterns emerged. "Didn't you say your lock was a Benton lock?" neighbors asked each other. "Strange, because I use him too, and something odd happened last week." The web of suspicion grew, but without proof, it was just rumor. An investigator notices the pattern. The break came from an unusual place. Detective Alan Moore, a mid-level investigator in the local police, had a habit of reading every minor report filed in the district. He noticed something. The burglaries without forced entry were almost always tied to properties serviced by one locksmith. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence. After all, Benton had been in the trade for decades. Of course, many locks bore his name. But when Moore mapped the reports, the clustering was too obvious to ignore. A dozen cases in 2 years, then 2 dozen. Always the same quiet intrusion, the same absence of damage, the same subtle disarray described by tenants and shopkeepers. Moore began dropping into Benton's shop under the pretense of casual need. He had keys copied, watched the man work, asked idle questions. He noted the drawers beneath the counter, the nervous way Benton shifted when asked about record keeping. Most locksmiths kept a log of duplicates for reference. Benton claimed his records had been misplaced, then later said he had never kept them at all. That inconsistency was enough to deepen Moore's suspicions. The locksmith's mask. Outwardly, Benton remained the same man he had always been. He attended church on Sundays. He tipped the paper boy. He donated to the local Veterans Hall. In fact, his public generosity seemed to grow in step with the hidden profits of his trade. This double life is what fascinates criminologists to this day. Why do some men, surrounded by ordinary lives, choose to manipulate trust so quietly? Benton wasn't flamboyant. He wasn't reckless. He thrived on the opposite, being boring, dependable, invisible. And in that invisibility, he found the space to commit one of the strangest forms of theft imaginable, selling the same promise of security twice, once to the rightful owner and once to the intruder. The whispers turned louder. By the time rumors reached the town council, unease had spread. Landlords began asking tenants if they felt safe. Businesses quietly sought out locksmiths from neighboring towns. Benton noticed a shift in his shop traffic, but he brushed it off as seasonal. He still had steady work, and his sideline continued to provide profit. Yet whispers have power, and in small towns, whispers can destroy. Parents began warning children not to linger outside the locksmith's shop. The postman reported seeing fewer people stopping in. And Detective Moore, quietly building his case, began pressing victims to reconsider their reluctance. How many incidents, he asked, could be chalked up to carelessness before the pattern became undeniable? The question left hanging. Section 1 of this story closes not with an arrest, but with tension. Benton still ran his shop, still cut keys while customers waited, still polished his sign in the window each morning. But the foundation of trust was crumbling beneath him. Detective Moore had a theory, Margaret Hines had her suspicions, and the town had its whispers. But proof remained elusive. After all, how do you accuse a locksmith of duplicating trust itself? And so, as the investigation lingered in its quiet beginnings, one question hung in the air. If every lock in town could be opened, who truly held the keys, the people who owned them, or the locksmith who made them? When you look back at criminal cases, there's often a clear moment where everything turns. A witness speaks, a slip is made, a piece of evidence changes the course of the investigation. But in the case of Harold Benton, the locksmith who sold the same keys twice, the turning point wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like rust spreading through iron. For years, the town had lived with an unspoken unease. Only when enough small suspicions were gathered together did the true scope of his betrayal begin to take shape. Detective Moore's obsession. Detective Alan Moore wasn't the sort of investigator who made headlines. He wasn't dramatic, wasn't charismatic, and wasn't known for bold arrests. Instead, his reputation inside the department was for persistence. He had a habit of chasing down the cases others found too small, too boring. Lost property, minor burglaries, unexplained entries, the things colleagues often filed away as unsolvable. Benton's quiet crimes fell squarely into that category. For months, Moore reviewed reports no one else cared about. Drawers shuffled, cash boxes lightened, trunks opened and relocked. What intrigued him was the absence of forced entry. Any patrol officer could have told him that burglars were usually messy. They broke windows, they forced doors, they left scratches on locks. But in Benton's town, something was different. Moore began keeping his own private notebook. Every report of entry without damage went in. Addresses, dates, times. Slowly, the clustering became undeniable, and at the center of it all stood one unassuming man with a key file and a sign in his shop window. The locksmith's clients. To understand how Benton pulled this off, you have to picture his clientele. This was not a large city with sprawling apartment complexes or high-rise offices. It was a town where landlords still knew their tenants by name, where shopkeepers swept their own doorsteps, and where locksmith services were requested in person. Benton was the man they called when a back door jammed or when a tenant lost a key. Landlords relied heavily on him, especially those who owned multiple properties. He often cut master keys, one that opened every door in a given building. Such keys were meant to remain in trusted hands only. But Benton quietly duplicated them, slipping an extra into his drawer before handing over the legitimate copy. Businesses too depended on him. Small shops had one lock on the front door and another on the cash office. Benton serviced them both, listening carefully when owners complained about long hours or when they mentioned taking vacations. Every detail was useful. Every absence was an opportunity. Selling the duplicates. The way Benton distributed the duplicates was remarkably subtle. He never advertised, never solicited openly. Instead, he relied on intermediaries, men who floated between petty crime and casual labor. One might drink at the tavern with Benton's cousin. Another might owe a debt to a card game regular who mentioned a friend who could help. The transaction was often disguised. A man would come in for a custom lockbox, pay cash, and leave with a key that opened a storefront. Another might ask about special blanks and receive a copy of a master key in a plain envelope. Benton never named the locations aloud. He kept everything coded, simple, untraceable. What fascinated investigators later was how ordinary the exchanges were. Benton wasn't feeding a large-scale burglary ring. He wasn't orchestrating elaborate heists. He was fueling dozens of tiny, forgettable crimes, the kind most towns absorbed without fanfare. It was this very ordinariness that kept him hidden for so long. The victims speak. Detective Moore's challenge was persuading victims to speak more boldly. Many were embarrassed. To admit someone had entered their home without breaking in felt like admitting weakness. Others feared retaliation. If a burglar had a key, what would stop him from returning? Moore began visiting them personally. He asked them to describe what was missing, what was disturbed. He listened for the subtleties. "My kitchen chair was moved," or "the lock clicked differently last night." Over and over, the same refrain emerged. There was no damage, no break, just an unsettling sense of intrusion. The breakthrough came when Moore convinced two shop owners to compare notes. Both ran small businesses a block apart. Both had hired Benton within the last year. Both had reported unexplained losses from cash drawers, small enough to avoid headlines but enough to sting. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Setting a trap. Moore knew suspicion wasn't enough. He needed proof. With the help of the cooperative shopkeepers, he devised a plan. They would request new locks from Benton, wait for the installation, and then allow Moore to mark the keys in a way invisible to the eye but detectable under light. If duplicates surfaced, the markings would betray them. The trap was risky. If Benton caught wind of it, he might retreat into caution, and the chance to catch him would vanish. Still, the shopkeepers agreed. They were tired of feeling watched in their own businesses. When Benton installed the locks, Moore watched from across the street, careful not to draw attention. Benton's manner was ordinary, his smile polite. He handed over the keys with practiced cheer, tucked his tools into his bag, and left. Nothing seemed out of place. But days later, under controlled observation, one of the shop's doors was opened not by its rightful key holder, but by a man arrested in another burglary. In his pocket was a copy of the same marked key Benton had handed over. The evidence was small, but to Moore, it was enough to push further. The locksmith's drawer. Armed with suspicion and a growing file of circumstantial evidence, Moore petitioned for a warrant. It wasn't easy. Judges were reluctant to authorize searches based on hunches about a respected tradesman. Benton's reputation was still intact in many eyes. But when the warrant was granted, Moore and a small team entered Benton's shop after hours. What they found beneath the counter confirmed what Moore had long believed. Inside a locked drawer were dozens of keys, each tagged in Benton's neat handwriting. Some bore the names of businesses. Others were marked with initials, addresses, or vague symbols only Benton could decode. Many were master keys. The drawer wasn't a collection of curiosities. It was an inventory, a secret library of access. The town reacts. When word leaked that Benton was under investigation, shock rippled through the community. This was not a gangster, not a drifter, not an outsider. This was their locksmith, the man who had installed their locks, cut their spares, reassured them about their safety. Newspapers picked up the story cautiously at first. The crimes were difficult to quantify. How do you measure the theft of trust? But as more victims came forward, the scale of Benton's scheme became clearer. He had touched dozens of lives, sometimes taking only small amounts, sometimes nothing at all, as though the act of entering, of knowing he could, was satisfaction enough. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones. Parents scolded children for ever lingering near the shop. Landlords demanded immediate rekeying of entire buildings. And for the first time in years, people began questioning the very objects they carried in their pockets. Was their key truly theirs, or had it already been sold twice? Benton's silence. Through it all, Benton remained composed. When questioned, he denied wrongdoing. The keys in his drawer, he claimed, were simply uncollected spares. The markings were reminders for himself. As for the burglar caught with the duplicate, Benton suggested it must have been a copy of a copy, hardly his fault if someone else chose to duplicate his work. This calmness unsettled even seasoned investigators. Benton never raised his voice, never contradicted himself, never admitted guilt. He spoke as though he were the victim of misunderstanding, a tradesman maligned by coincidence. But Moore wasn't convinced. Too many reports aligned, too many victims described the same uncanny pattern. The locksmith's hands might have been steady, but his trade had been poisoned by his choices. The expanding investigation. Once Benton's practices came under scrutiny, investigators from neighboring towns joined in. They discovered that his duplicating habit wasn't limited to his own community. Records linked him to properties in nearby counties where similar undisturbed burglaries had been reported. His network of petty thieves stretched farther than anyone first imagined. Each discovery widened the circle of betrayal. What had begun as whispers in one town now spread across an entire region. Benton's name, once synonymous with trust, became shorthand for quiet violation. The unanswered puzzle. And yet, even as the investigation expanded, mysteries lingered. How many duplicates had Benton truly made? How many burglaries went unreported because victims were too embarrassed to admit their homes had been entered? How many keys sat in drawers waiting while their owners believed themselves safe? Detective Moore, for all his persistence, admitted privately that he would never know the full scope. Too many crimes were small, too many details lost to time. Benton's genius lay in that very ordinariness. He turned security into vulnerability so quietly that people barely noticed until years had passed. The cliffhanger. As Section 2 closes, Benton has been exposed but not yet broken. The town knows his name, the police have his drawer of duplicates, and the network of thieves begins to unravel. But still, questions remain. Would Benton ever confess? Would the courts accept the evidence against him? Or would he, like so many quiet criminals, slip through the cracks of technicality and doubt? The investigation was tightening, but the resolution was not yet in sight. And the community, living with the knowledge that their locks had been compromised for years, waited uneasily for the answer. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. And in the case of Harold Benton, the locksmith who sold the same keys twice, the community's trust was not just fractured, it was shattered. As the investigation grew, as more stories surfaced of strange entries and subtle thefts, the quiet man behind the counter became something far more unsettling, the symbol of betrayal in its most ordinary form. This final section brings his story to its climax: the courtroom, the verdict, and the long shadow he left behind. Arrest and charges. The arrest itself was uneventful. Detectives entered Benton's shop one morning with a warrant. They confiscated the drawer of keys, his files, and the marked envelopes where duplicates had been found. Benton didn't resist. He didn't shout. He simply placed his tools on the counter and waited while the officers searched. The charges, however, were anything but simple. Prosecutors faced a difficult task. How do you prosecute someone not for breaking locks but for creating them? Benton hadn't forced entry himself in many cases. He had enabled others. Some burglaries tied directly to his duplicates, but many remained unproven. Victims were hesitant to testify. Without obvious theft or damage, jurors might see the crimes as speculation. Still, the prosecutors moved forward with charges of conspiracy, fraud, and aiding burglary. They knew Benton's trial would be about more than theft. It would be about whether trust in the locksmith's trade could be restored. The evidence. At the heart of the case was the drawer, the neat, organized library of keys Benton had hidden beneath his counter. Each tag, each marking, told a story. Investigators matched some to specific addresses, others to businesses. In several instances, burglaries lined up directly with the possession of those keys. The most compelling evidence remained the marked key recovered from the arrested burglar. It bore the invisible signature Detective Moore had placed on it. That connection created a direct line from Benton's shop to a crime scene. Still, defense attorneys fought back. They argued that locksmiths often held spares, that duplicates were sometimes made for convenience, sometimes left behind when customers failed to return. They insisted the connection between Benton and the burglar was circumstantial. The courtroom became a battleground not of violence, but of words about whether intention could be proven through grooves in metal. Testimonies. Victims took the stand reluctantly. Margaret Hinds, the schoolteacher who had first sensed something wrong in her apartment, testified about the unsettling feeling of intrusion. She spoke quietly, her hands clasped, describing how her drawers had been moved, her rugs shifted, her privacy invaded without evidence of a break. Shopkeepers followed, describing missing cash and re-locked doors. Landlords recounted the strange duplications of master keys. Each story added weight, not just to the evidence, but to the emotional impact. The jury listened not just to facts, but to fear. Each testimony painted Benton not as a criminal mastermind, but as something worse, an ordinary man who had betrayed the ordinary trust of ordinary people. Benton's defense. When Benton himself took the stand, he was calm, almost unnervingly so. He denied wrongdoing with steady composure. The keys, he claimed, were spares uncollected by forgetful customers. He admitted to poor bookkeeping, but not to criminal intent. "I cut what was asked," he said. "If others misused them, that is not my crime." His words carried a kind of logic, and some jurors leaned in with interest. After all, was it truly illegal for a locksmith to hold onto unclaimed duplicates? Could the state prove he had sold them, rather than merely kept them? It was a defense built on technicality, but technicalities often sway juries. Detective Moore's testimony. The prosecution's strongest moment came when Detective Alan Moore took the stand. He described his months of investigation, the mapping of burglaries, the pattern only visible when all reports were viewed together. He detailed the sting operation with the marked key, showing how Benton's duplicate ended up in a burglar's pocket. Most of all, Moore spoke about the nature of trust. "When you hand a locksmith your key," he said, "you are handing them the boundary of your life, your home, your business, your privacy. That trust is sacred. Mr. Benton sold that trust twice." His words hung heavy in the courtroom. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the room was silent. Benton was found guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy and aiding burglary. The fraud charges were upheld, though some minor accusations were dismissed for lack of proof. Benton's sentence was not lengthy compared to violent criminals. He served several years in state prison. But in many ways, the formal punishment mattered less than the informal one. His name was ruined, his trade destroyed, his community permanently scarred. Consequences for the town. After Benton's conviction, locksmiths across the state faced new scrutiny. Regulations tightened. Record-keeping became mandatory. Police developed closer ties with locksmithing associations to ensure accountability. What had once been a trade built largely on trust now required oversight. In Benton's town, the effects were even more personal. Many residents replaced every lock in their homes, even when it was costly. Businesses spent money they could barely afford on security upgrades. The psychological damage was harder to repair. People no longer assumed their locks kept them safe. Margaret Hinds eventually moved away, unable to shake the feeling of being watched in her own apartment. Shopkeepers who had lost small sums never forgot the betrayal, and Detective Moore, though commended for his persistence, admitted privately that the case left him uneasy. For every key he recovered, how many others remained in unknown hands? The broader legacy. Criminologists often cite Benton's case when discussing low-drama, crime offenses that don't rely on violence or spectacle, but on betrayal of trust. Like embezzlement, forgery, or quiet fraud, these crimes erode the fabric of community from within. Benton's method was simple. He sold the same promise twice. First, to the rightful owner who believed a key meant safety. Second, to the intruder who knew safety could be undone with a twist of metal. That simplicity made it effective and dangerous. The legacy of the case extended far beyond one town. Locksmithing schools began emphasizing ethics more heavily. Police began teaching recruits to pay attention to patterns in minor reports. And communities, however reluctantly, learned that even the quietest figures in town could conceal unsettling secrets. Reflection. When you think of crime, you may picture sirens, car chases, or masked figures breaking glass. But the story of Harold Benton reminds us that some of the most disturbing crimes are quiet. No alarms, no smashed windows, only the sound of a key turning in a lock, and the knowledge that safety is never absolute. In the end, the question isn't whether Benton was guilty, the court answered that. The lingering question is deeper. If trust can be sold twice, can it ever truly be bought back? If you've ever stepped into a library after hours, you'll know the strange hush it carries. The faint tick of a clock, the smell of paper and dust, the rows of shelves standing like watchful sentries. A library is not just a building. It is a memory, a record of who we were and what we cared to preserve. And like all memory, it depends on trust in those who tend it, who catalog it, who guard it. In a small town in the American Midwest, that trust was broken not by fire, not by flood, but by the steady hand of a librarian who decided to erase history one page at a time. Her name was Eleanor Wilkes, a woman of order. Eleanor had worked at the county archives for nearly 30 years. She was known for her quiet efficiency. Her hair always tied in a neat bun, her glasses perched at the tip of her nose. She carried the air of someone born to keep order. She spoke softly, rarely smiled, and seemed to live within the neat boxes of the card catalog she loved so much. The archives were her domain, a small, climate-controlled wing of the library that housed deeds, tax rolls, land records, old newspapers, and personal letters donated by families. Few visited except genealogists or historians. To most townspeople, Eleanor was a background figure, as invisible as the shelves she guarded. But to those who relied on her, she was indispensable. She knew every box, every drawer. If you needed your grandfather's will, Eleanor could retrieve it in minutes. If you asked about the original survey of your farmland, she could point to the exact map case. She was, by all accounts, the guardian of the town's collective memory. The first erasures. The crime began so quietly that no one noticed at first. A researcher looking for an 1892 tax ledger couldn't find it. Eleanor said it must have been misfiled. A genealogist searching for baptism records found a gap in the roll of microfilm. Eleanor suggested damage from humidity. But the absences multiplied. A newspaper reel from 1910, a land deed from 1865. Entire folders gone, yet the gaps were subtle, a missing page here, a vanished box there. Libraries are imperfect places. Materials get misplaced, mislabeled, even stolen by careless visitors. At first, no one blamed Eleanor. But years later, when the losses were tallied, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Motives in the margins. Why would someone erase archives? What could possibly be gained from the disappearance of old tax rolls or yellowed newspapers? Investigators later debated Eleanor's motives. Some argued she was hiding corruption, destroying land deeds to benefit developers, erasing tax records to protect wealthy families. Others suggested personal reasons. Perhaps she erased documents connected to her own ancestors, tidying away shameful stories. And then there was a darker theory, that Eleanor's motive was control. In a world where memory is power, she alone decided what survived. To choose which stories remained was to become the silent author of history itself. The whispering genealogists. The first group to truly question Eleanor's explanations were the genealogists. These were the men and women who spent hours squinting at microfilm, tracing family trees. They were obsessive in their detail, often knowing the archives as well as Eleanor did. And they began whispering among themselves. Did you notice the 1904 census is incomplete? Yes, and the probate files from that year are gone too. She says they're damaged, but damaged in the exact same decade. The whispers spread to local historians, who found their own projects stalling on sudden gaps. A professor seeking letters from Civil War veterans discovered an entire folder missing. A graduate student studying industrial growth noticed the disappearance of factory tax rolls. The pattern was too precise to be accident. The historian's complaint. It was a young historian from the state university, Dr. Michael Clark, who finally put the puzzle in writing. Frustrated by repeated roadblocks, he drafted a formal complaint to the county commission. The integrity of your archives is in question. Multiple records across multiple decades are missing. Explanations offered by staff do not suffice. If these records have been destroyed, whether by negligence or intent, your community is losing its history. The letter forced the county's hand. An internal audit of the archives was ordered. Eleanor, for the first time in her career, faced scrutiny. The audit. The audit revealed what many had suspected. The losses were systematic. Missing records were not random. They clustered around particular families, particular businesses, and particular events. Entire decades were thinned of detail. Boxes were not misfiled, they were erased. When confronted, Eleanor maintained her calm. She spoke of floods that had dampened paper, of insects that had chewed bindings, of careless volunteers who had mis-shelved reels. But the auditors found no evidence of these disasters. The building's conditions were stable, climate controls were intact, and the missing documents aligned too neatly with one another. Still, proving intent was difficult. Without catching Eleanor in the act, how could they show she had deliberately removed the records? Suspicion falls on her routine. Investigators began to study her habits. Eleanor was often the first to arrive and the last to leave. She carried a large handbag, though no one questioned it. The archives had no cameras, no sign-in logs for staff. Security was minimal. Who would suspect the librarian? Colleagues remembered her lingering after hours, claiming to reorganize shelves. Volunteers recalled her directing them away from certain sections, insisting she would handle those herself. In retrospect, these behaviors looked suspicious. At the time, they were chalked up to her meticulous personality. But now, every small detail was reinterpreted as evidence of erasure. The human cost. The missing records carried real consequences. Families could not prove ownership of farmland. Descendants could not trace ancestry beyond certain years. Historians abandoned projects when source material evaporated. Even the county government found itself unable to settle disputes without the very documents Eleanor had overseen. The erasures were not violent, not spectacular, but they quietly undermined the legal and cultural fabric of the town. A missing deed could change inheritance. A missing tax roll could erase a debt. A missing letter could silence a voice from history. And each absence, however small, traced back to the quiet librarian who seemed incapable of wrongdoing. The growing question. By the end of Section 1, Eleanor Wilkes had not been charged. She still walked the quiet aisles of the archive, still cataloged new donations with her steady hand. But shadows followed her now. Genealogists avoided her gaze. Historians whispered in corners. County officials debated whether to remove her quietly or risk a scandal. And so, the question lingered in the air. Was Eleanor a guardian of memory, or its eraser? Every crime has a rhythm, a sequence of choices that make sense only when seen in retrospect. For Eleanor Wilkes, the librarian accused of erasing the archives, the rhythm was quiet, almost invisible. She didn't take money from a till, didn't force her way into homes, didn't brandish a weapon. Her crime, if it could be proven, was one of subtraction, removing words from the record until whole stories vanished. By the time the county realized how much was missing, the damage was already done. Now, the investigation turned to motive and whether the seemingly unremarkable librarian had deliberately altered the memory of her town. The audit expands. After the first audit revealed systematic losses, the county called in outside help. A team of archivists from the State Historical Society arrived with gloves, flashlights, and clipboards. They weren't investigators by trade, but they understood patterns of preservation. They found what local auditors had missed. Newspaper reels had been cleanly cut and spliced, with specific years removed. Probate files had pages neatly sliced out, not torn. These were not the random damages of time. These were acts of precision, of someone who understood the system intimately. The archivist also noticed the absence of withdrawal records. In proper archives, when materials are loaned or moved, a slip records the transaction. Aliner's files were immaculate in other areas, yet dozens of withdrawal slips were missing. It was as though entire transactions had been scrubbed from existence. Their report was damning. The pattern of losses strongly suggests intentional removal and concealment. The individual responsible has significant knowledge of archival systems and long-term access. Though the report did not name her directly, everyone knew who that meant. Motives under the microscope. Speculation about Aliner's motive became the town's favorite whisper. Some thought it financial, that she was destroying records to benefit land developers or wealthy families with embarrassing pasts. Others believed it was personal, that she was hiding the criminal record of a relative or erasing debts connected to her family name. But some suspected a darker motive: ideology. If you control the past, you control the present. By erasing scandals, crimes, or failures, Aliner might have been curating a sanitized version of the town's history. When reporters finally cornered her outside the library, Aliner gave only one statement: "Not everything deserves to be remembered." Her words, quiet as they were, sent a chill through the community. Detective Laura Jennings. The county sheriff's office assigned Detective Laura Jennings to the case. Unlike Alan Moore in the Locksmith affair, Jennings was younger, ambitious, and eager to make a name. She approached the case not as a puzzle of books and papers, but as a classic investigation of opportunity and intent. Jennings began interviewing Aliner's colleagues. Most described her as meticulous, controlling, and territorial. Volunteers said she hovered over their work, often redirecting them away from certain shelves. A janitor recalled seeing her carry boxes to her car late at night. Jennings also tracked Aliner's family connections. The Wilkes line went back generations in the county, with ties to farming, land disputes, and even a scandal in the 1920s involving unpaid taxes. Several of the missing records, curiously, connected to those very disputes. The outline of a motive began to emerge. The genealogists unite. Meanwhile, the amateur genealogists who had first noticed the gaps became something of an unofficial investigative team. They gathered in the library basement, comparing notes, cross-referencing family lines. They created lists of missing documents and plotted them against surnames. Patterns appeared. Entire branches of certain families were harder to trace. Records of bankruptcies in the late 19th century were gone, as were court cases involving prominent landowners. It was as though someone had carefully pruned the family tree, removing diseased branches to make the whole appear healthy. The genealogists presented their findings to Detective Jennings, who was impressed by their rigor. Their work gave her leads that official audits had overlooked. Aliner's silence. Throughout the inquiry, Aliner maintained a sphinx-like calm. She arrived at the archives each morning, unlocked the doors, and went about her duties. When questioned, she answered politely but minimally. When pressed about the missing documents, she repeated her refrain: misfiling, damage, accidents. But her demeanor unsettled colleagues. There was no outrage at being accused, no grief at the loss of records, no indignation on behalf of the institution she served. She seemed almost detached, as if she had already accepted the outcome. Jennings noted this in her case file. Subject displays indifference to accusations, possible indication of belief in righteousness of her actions. A box in the attic. The breakthrough came not in the library but in Alina's home. With a warrant, investigators searched her modest two-story house. In the attic, beneath old quilts, they found several boxes containing records that should have been in the county archive. Inside were probate files, tax rolls, and letters donated by families. Many were marked with red pencil in Alina's handwriting. Remove, irrelevant, damaged. The discovery was damning. It proved that she had not merely lost or misfiled records, she had taken them. The question now was why. The letters. Among the boxes were letters that caught particular attention. They detailed a scandal involving a local industrialist in the 1910s who had employed child labor and bribed officials. The industrialist's descendants still held influence in the county. The missing documents had effectively shielded that legacy from easy discovery. Another set of letters revealed that Alina's own grandfather had been implicated in a tax evasion scheme in the 1920s. Those records, too, were among the missing. The pattern became clearer. Alina had not erased at random. She had curated. She had decided which stains on the town's memory would be scrubbed away and which stories would be allowed to remain. The confrontation. Detective Jennings confronted Alina with the boxes. For the first time, cracks appeared in her composure. She admitted removing the documents but insisted it was for preservation. The county doesn't have the resources, she argued. I was protecting them until they could be digitized. But the red pencil markings undermined her claim. Why mark documents for removal if preservation was the goal? Jennings pressed harder. Why, she asked, were certain families disproportionately affected? Why were records tied to Alina's grandfather missing? Why the statement, "Not everything deserves to be remembered"? Alina fell silent. The town's reaction. News of the attic boxes spread quickly. For many, it confirmed the worst, that the guardian of their history had been its eraser. Families who lost ancestral links were furious. Historians expressed outrage. Local newspapers ran headlines about the librarian of forgetting. But a minority defended Alina. Some argued she had only removed embarrassing stains, that perhaps she was right, not everything deserved to be remembered. Others suggested her motives were protective, shielding families from shame or the town from scandal. The debate split the community. Was Alina a criminal or a misguided custodian of memory? The cliffhanger. By the end of Section 2, the evidence against Alina was strong. She had been caught with missing documents in her possession. Motives tied to both personal and political interests were clear. Yet she had not confessed, and the town remained divided over her intent. The trial loomed ahead, but one question remained unresolved. Was Alina Wilkes a thief of history, or its self-appointed editor? When you strip away the drama of fire, the chaos of floods, or the destruction of war, the slow erasure of archives might seem trivial by comparison. A page gone here, a roll missing there, what harm could it do? But as Alina Wilkes stood trial, her case forced an entire community to confront an uncomfortable truth. History is not indestructible. It depends on the people who guard it, and when those people betray their duty, the damage can be as devastating as any natural disaster. The charges. Alina was indicted on charges of theft of public records, tampering with government documents, and official misconduct. Though she was not accused of personal enrichment in the traditional sense, she hadn't sold the missing files. Prosecutors argued that she had abused her position of trust and permanently damaged the county's legal and historical integrity. The charges carried real weight. Under state law, the destruction or concealment of official records was a felony, punishable by years in prison. Still, some in the community doubted whether the jury would convict. After all, Alina had been a fixture of the archives for 3 decades. She was not a violent criminal. She was, in many eyes, simply the librarian. The courtroom atmosphere. The trial drew unusual attention. Local newspapers covered every detail, and genealogists from across the region packed the gallery, notebooks in hand. Families whose histories had been erased came to watch, eager for justice. Others, more sympathetic, whispered that the state was making an example of an elderly woman whose worst crime was perhaps caring too much. Alina herself remained composed. She dressed in modest skirts and cardigans, her hair tied in the same bun she had worn for decades. She sat quietly at the defense table, eyes lowered, occasionally jotting notes in the margins of her legal pad as if she were cataloging the trial itself. The prosecution's case. The prosecutor built the case methodically. First came the state archivists, who testified to the precision of the removals, the clean cuts in microfilm, the red pencil markings, the systematic pattern of missing decades. Then came the genealogists, presenting charts of absent names and broken family lines. Most powerful of all was the evidence from Alina's attic, the boxes of records marked "Remove." Jurors studied the handwriting, the neat labels, the files that should have been housed safely in the county archive. This was not carelessness, the prosecutor argued. This was editing. Mrs. Wilkes decided she alone would determine what your community remembered and what it forgot. The defense. Alina's attorney, however, painted a different picture. He described her as overworked and underpaid, left alone to manage decades of fragile records with little institutional support. He argued that she had removed documents for safekeeping, intending eventually to preserve them. "She is not a thief," he said. "She is a librarian, and she has been made a scapegoat for the county's decades of neglect." The defense leaned heavily on Alina's reputation, her decades of service, and the absence of financial gain. They admitted her methods were unorthodox, but denied criminal intent. Alina speaks. When Alina herself took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. For the first time, she spoke at length about her choices. "These archives were crumbling," she said. "No one cared. Year after year I asked for funds for help. No one listened, so I made decisions. Yes, I removed documents. Yes, I destroyed some. Not everything deserves to be remembered. Some things only bring shame, anger, division." Her words sent ripples through the room. Supporters nodded, detractors shook their heads. To some, she was confessing outright. To others, she was revealing the loneliness of her role, forced to act as the final filter of memory. The prosecutor pressed her. "Who gave you the right to decide what is remembered?" Alina's answer was simple. No one else was deciding. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the end, they returned with a split verdict. Alina was found guilty of theft of public records and official misconduct, but acquitted on some counts of tampering where evidence of destruction was less clear. The sentence was lighter than some expected: 2 years in state prison, followed by probation. The judge, in his remarks, acknowledged her years of service but emphasized the gravity of her betrayal. "You were entrusted with the memory of this community," he said. "You had no right to erase it." The aftermath. The trial left scars that lasted years. The county embarked on an expensive effort to recatalog and digitize what remained of its archives. Volunteers worked long hours trying to reconstruct family trees broken by Alina's removals. Some records were recovered from her attic, but many were gone forever. Genealogists remained bitter. "She robbed us," one said, "not of money, but of our past." Families lamented the lost deeds and letters that might have settled disputes or connected generations. But others, quietly, admitted sympathy. They spoke of an underfunded archive, a lonely librarian burdened with impossible responsibility. They wondered whether Alina's crime was not simply hers, but also the result of a system that left her isolated, without oversight or support. Broader reforms. The state took notice. Funding for archives increased. Counties were required to implement strict tracking of withdrawals, regular audits, and mandatory digitization. Archivists were no longer left alone in their work. Teams were formed, oversight committees established. Aliner's case became a cautionary tale taught in archival schools. The danger of centralizing too much power in a single custodian, the importance of transparency, and the fragility of collective memory. Reflection. In the end, the story of Aliner Wilkes was not just about missing papers. It was about the deeper crime of deciding, unilaterally, what a community deserves to remember. Unlike theft of money, theft of memory is invisible. You do not notice its absence until you reach for it and find nothing. A deed missing here, a letter vanished there until the past itself feels uncertain. As Aliner began her sentence, the town faced a question it had never asked before. If history can be erased from within, how can we ever be sure of what remains? If crime has a beating heart, it isn't always found in back alleys or smoky bars. Sometimes it lives in ledgers, in columns of numbers that quietly decide who gets rich, who stays hidden, and who takes the fall. While gangsters drew headlines with shootouts and extortion rackets, the people who made their world function often went unnoticed. Accountants, the men with pens instead of pistols, were among the most dangerous of all. This story is about one such man, a quiet accountant who managed to balance two sets of books, one for the government and one for the mob. A respectable front. His name was Charles "Charlie" Winfield, though in the underworld he was simply called the Clerk. By day, Charlie operated a modest accounting practice in Chicago during the 1950s. He helped small businesses prepare tax returns, balanced budgets for corner grocers, and kept ledgers for landlords. He was mild-mannered, bespectacled, and famously punctual. Clients described him as trustworthy, even dull. He wore the same gray suit nearly every day, carried a briefcase polished but worn at the edges, and rarely raised his voice. He was the kind of man who would never be suspected of anything more scandalous than misplacing a receipt. Yet beneath this facade, Charlie managed the financial lifeblood of one of the most feared crime syndicates in the Midwest. The mob's problem. Organized crime, despite its aura of glamour and danger, has always faced a practical problem: money. Illegal profits need to be concealed, moved, and disguised. Bootlegging during Prohibition had shown mobsters how dangerous it was to flaunt unreported income. Tax evasion had brought down gangsters who survived bullets. The lesson was clear: bullets couldn't kill as effectively as ledgers could. A mobster could intimidate rivals, bribe police, even control unions. But if the IRS came knocking with proof of undeclared millions, there was little to be done. That's where accountants like Charlie came in. He offered what the mob needed most: invisibility. 2 sets of books. Charlie's brilliance was not in invention, but in precision. He created 2 sets of books for every mob-controlled business. The clean books, these showed modest profits, regular expenses, and enough taxes paid to keep the government satisfied. They looked ordinary, even boring, which was exactly the point. The real books hidden in locked cabinets, these revealed the actual flow of money. Protection rackets disguised as consulting fees, bribes labeled as miscellaneous expenses, and gambling profits washed through cash-heavy businesses like laundromats and diners. Charlie made sure the numbers lined up perfectly. No loose ends, no unexplained discrepancies. If a federal agent cross-checked the clean books against bank deposits, they matched. If a mob boss demanded to know the real intake, Charlie had the figures down to the penny. In a world of violence, his weapon was balance. The price of trust. To the mob, accountants were both invaluable and dangerous. They knew too much. A careless word, a misplaced document could unravel entire operations. For that reason, few accountants lasted long. Some were silenced after mistakes. Others fled when pressure became too heavy. Charlie, however, survived. He earned the trust of bosses by being meticulous and by never asking questions he didn't need answered. He was punctual with his ledgers, discreet with his words, and generous with his silences. And yet trust came at a price. Once you balanced books for the mob, there was no easy way out. Early suspicions. Law enforcement first became aware of Charlie not through crime reports, but through patterns in tax filings. An IRS investigator named Ruth Delgado noticed something odd. Several unrelated businesses across Chicago reported suspiciously consistent profit margins. A laundromat, a diner, a small trucking firm all listed profits that hovered just above average year after year. Delgado had seen enough cases to know that legitimate businesses fluctuated. They had good years and bad years, but these businesses were eerily stable, almost as if someone had engineered the numbers. Her suspicion grew stronger when she discovered that all of them used the same accountant, Charles Winfield. The whisper of an informant. At the same time, within the mob's world, rumors circulated. A low-level bookkeeper arrested on gambling charges hinted that the clerk knew everything. Detectives pressed him, but he clammed up, fearful of reprisal. Still, the whisper was enough to reach Delgado's desk. If the IRS could prove Charlie was running two sets of books, they might not only convict him, but also dismantle the financial backbone of the syndicate. The government had learned from Al Capone's trial decades earlier. The way to cripple organized crime wasn't with bullets, but with tax ledgers. Charlie's double life. While investigators circled, Charlie's daily life remained deceptively ordinary. He lived alone in a modest apartment, cooked simple meals, and spent weekends reading financial journals. He didn't drink heavily, didn't gamble, and avoided the flamboyance that marked many mob associates. His neighbors thought of him as dull, even lonely, but that was by design. Charlie knew invisibility was his best protection. If gangsters kept him alive for his usefulness, ordinary citizens ignored him for his dullness. Both perspectives suited him just fine. But the double life was wearing thin. His briefcase, always heavy with ledgers, felt like a burden he could no longer put down. The growing tension. By the mid-1950s, the mob's profits were soaring. Gambling, racketeering, and construction kickbacks all funneled through Charlie's careful hands. The clean books had to be more convincing than ever, while the real books grew thicker with every passing year. At the same time, the IRS's focus on organized crime intensified. Delgado and her colleagues subpoenaed records, interviewed business owners, and looked for cracks in the facade. They were convinced that if they could pressure Charlie, the entire financial empire might collapse. The mob noticed this attention too. Whispers reached Charlie. Federal agents had his name on their lists. For the first time, his unassuming facade seemed under threat. The unanswered question. By the end of Section 1, Charlie stood at a crossroads. He had balanced the mob's books for years without a single error. But now, both the government and the gangsters were watching him closely. One question loomed. Would Charlie's loyalty to the numbers protect him or finally destroy him? For Charlie Winfield, numbers were never just abstractions. They were weapons, shields, and secrets. To the mob, he was indispensable, a man who could transform illicit profits into neat rows of figures that looked legitimate to the untrained eye. To the government, he was a potential key, the weak link in a syndicate otherwise insulated by fear and violence. By the mid-1950s, Charlie had perfected the art of invisibility. But as investigators circled and mob bosses grew more paranoid, his ledgers transformed from tools of control into ticking time bombs. Ruth Delgado's pursuit. IRS investigator Ruth Delgado had made a career of spotting patterns others missed. She wasn't impressed by mobsters who flaunted wealth. She was fascinated by the accountants who tried to hide it. In her view, the real criminals weren't always the men holding guns, but the men holding pens. Delgado built her case slowly. She subpoenaed bank records from laundromats, diners, and trucking firms tied to the mob. She compared deposits to reported profits, scanning for anomalies. Again and again, she noticed what had first caught her eye: unnatural stability. Businesses that should have fluctuated rode the same flat line of modest income. She began interviewing owners, most of whom shrugged nervously and insisted their accountant handled everything. Always the same accountant, Charles Winfield. The mob's growing paranoia. Inside the syndicate, suspicion was also brewing. Mob bosses trusted Charlie's work, but trust in their world was conditional, always fraying at the edges. Whispers reached them that federal agents were circling. If Charlie cracked, the entire empire of hidden profits could come crashing down. One lieutenant asked pointedly at a meeting, "What if the clerk starts talking?" Another replied, "Then the clerk don't get to talk." Charlie was valuable, but in the mob's calculus, no one was indispensable forever. The two briefcases. Charlie had developed a system of survival. Each day, he carried two briefcases. One contained the clean ledgers, the books he could show auditors, the records that looked dull and ordinary. The other contained the real numbers, the river of illicit cash disguised as consulting fees, construction invoices, or service charges. He guarded the second briefcase like a man guards his life, because in truth, it was his life. If the government seized it, he was finished. If the mob believed he had lost it, he was finished in another way. At night, he locked the second briefcase in a false-bottomed cabinet in his apartment. He never let it leave his sight during the day. It was his most dangerous possession and his only protection. Delgado finds a crack. Delgado's breakthrough came when she compared payroll records. A trucking company Charlie serviced reported 20 employees on its books, but union records showed closer to 50 men on the job. Where were the wages for the other 30? The answer was simple: ghost employees. Charlie had created fake names, assigning salaries that were funneled into mob coffers. The money trail was subtle, but Delgado traced it carefully. She finally had tangible proof that Winfield wasn't just creative with numbers, he was complicit in laundering organized crime's profits. The first interview. Delgado requested a formal interview with Charlie under the guise of a routine audit. He appeared as calm as ever, gray suit pressed, glasses polished, his tone polite but guarded. She began with harmless questions: revenue streams, expense reports, tax filings. Charlie answered smoothly, producing documents neatly tabbed in binders. But when she asked about the ghost employees, he hesitated for the first time. He adjusted his glasses, tapped his pen, and gave an answer too rehearsed. "Clerical error. My mistake. I'll correct it immediately." Delgado noted the shift. In her experience, mistakes happen randomly. But this mistake was too consistent, too profitable, and too convenient. The mob takes notice. Charlie didn't know it, but his interview with Delgado had been observed. A mob associate, stationed outside the IRS office, reported back that Charlie had been called in. Within days, the bosses summoned him to a meeting. They asked calmly, almost casually, "What did you tell them?" Charlie assured them he had said nothing of substance, that he had explained away the discrepancies. He emphasized his loyalty, his discretion, his years of service. But the bosses weren't reassured. In their world, once a man was under government scrutiny, he was a liability. The question was not if he would break, but when. The offer. Delgado, sensing Charlie's unease, pressed harder. She approached him not as an enemy, but as an escape. "You're the one holding this together," she told him. "If you cooperate, we can protect you. Witness protection. A new life. But if you keep carrying their books, you're carrying your coffin." It was the first time anyone had offered him a way out. But to accept meant betraying the mob, and betrayal was a death sentence in his world. Charlie didn't answer. He simply closed his briefcase and walked out. The numbers close in. The pressure mounted from both sides. Delgado subpoenaed more records, tightening the net. The mob tightened theirs too, sending men to shadow Charlie, watching for any sign he might turn informant. Charlie's nights grew restless. He triple-checked locks, woke at every sound, and sometimes sat at his kitchen table staring at his ledgers as though they might reveal an answer. For a man who had always lived invisibly, he now felt more exposed than ever. A dangerous balance. One evening, a mid-level enforcer arrived at his apartment unannounced. He poured himself a drink and leaned close. "You're too important to lose, Charlie," he said, voice almost kind. "But you're not too important to replace. Remember that." It was a reminder and a threat. Charlie nodded, said nothing, and pored over the numbers again that night. He knew the balance he had maintained for years was slipping. The government wanted his testimony. The mob wanted his silence, and both were prepared to destroy him if he chose wrong. The cliffhanger. As Section 2 ends, Charlie is caught between two forces. Delgado has the evidence to indict him, but also the promise of protection if he cooperates. The mob has the power to keep him alive or kill him depending on whether they believe his loyalty. The briefcase under his desk holds the truth, but the question remains. Would he open it for the government or die keeping it shut? Accountants aren't usually remembered in the lore of organized crime. The headlines go to the men with guns, the bosses in tailored suits, the enforcers who kept the rackets running. But when Charlie Winfield stood at his crossroads, the fate of an entire syndicate balanced not on bullets, but on his decision about what to do with a set of books. Would he talk? Would he remain silent? Or would he, like so many caught between the mob and the law, find that the choice was already made for him? The government's deadline. IRS investigator Ruth Delgado knew time was running out. She had evidence: the ghost employees, the suspiciously steady profits, the ties between Winfield's clients and mob businesses. But to dismantle the syndicate, she needed more. She needed the second set of books. She offered Charlie immunity in exchange for testimony. It was a gamble. The government had little to offer beyond relocation and a new identity. Could a man like Charlie, whose entire life was built around precision and routine, really imagine himself abandoning it all for anonymity? Delgado pressed, "You're already in danger. The only way out is forward." Charlie listened, but he didn't commit. He was a man trained to balance, and even now he couldn't tip the scales toward one side or the other. The mob's deadline. Meanwhile, the bosses were growing impatient. Word spread that Delgado had subpoenaed more records. Meetings grew tense, voices louder, and always the question returned: can we trust the clerk? Charlie was summoned again. This time the tone was sharper. One capo leaned across the table and asked, "If they offer you a deal, you gonna take it?" Charlie swallowed hard and answered carefully, "I've been with you 20 years. If I wanted to talk, I'd have done it already." The answer satisfied them for the moment. But paranoia is the currency of organized crime, and loyalty is never fully believed. The briefcase. Charlie's salvation or his doom lay in the briefcase hidden beneath his desk. Inside were the real books, years of ledgers that detailed every racket, every bribe, every laundering scheme. To the government, it was gold. To the mob, it was a loaded gun aimed at their heads. He would sometimes unlock it late at night and stare at the pages as if they might give him advice. They didn't. They only stared back, silent records of his complicity. The briefcase had become more than evidence. It was a symbol of the impossible choice. Whoever controlled it controlled Charlie's fate. A visit in the night. One night, Charlie returned home to find his apartment door ajar. He froze. Inside, the place looked untouched, but he knew immediately what had been disturbed: the cabinet where the briefcase lay hidden. The lock was scratched. The briefcase was gone. Panic surged. He tore through drawers, checked every corner, but it was clear. Someone had been inside. Someone had the real books. Which side had taken them, the mob or the government? He didn't know. Either way, his control was gone. Delgado's surprise. The next morning, Delgado appeared at his office with a calm smile. She set the briefcase on his desk. "We had a warrant," she said. "We searched your apartment last night. You can thank me that my people got to it before theirs did." Charlie's face drained of color. She opened the case, flipped through the ledgers, and tapped her finger against a column of numbers. "This is enough to bring them down, all of them, but only if you testify." She left him with the choice: testify and live under government protection, refuse and face both indictment and mob suspicion. The mob suspicion confirmed. It didn't take long for word to spread. The mob heard the government had seized something from Charlie's apartment. They didn't know what, but they knew enough. To them, this was betrayal. Even if Charlie hadn't spoken, the fact that his records were in government hands was damning. The bosses convened again, and this time the decision was swift. "The clerk's finished," one said flatly. "The last meeting." Charlie sensed it before it happened. He was summoned to a late-night discussion at a warehouse by the river. He knew what such meetings meant, yet he went perhaps out of resignation, perhaps because he could no longer imagine escape. The men greeted him with forced politeness. They poured drinks, asked about his work, then cut to the point. "You let them take the books," one said. "You doomed us." Charlie tried to explain that he hadn't chosen, that the warrant had forced his hand, that he had stayed silent. But in the mob's world, perception mattered more than truth. To them, silence was already betrayal. The men stood. The meeting was over. Charlie left the warehouse alive, but he knew he would not remain so for long. Delgado's frustration. When Delgado returned to collect his testimony, Charlie refused. He admitted the books were his, admitted they were accurate, but he would not take the stand. "I've survived this long by keeping quiet," he said. "I won't start talking now." It was a devastating blow to the government's case. Without his testimony, the ledgers were useful but not decisive. Defense attorneys could argue they were fabricated, taken out of context, or misunderstood. Delgado pressed, begged, reasoned, but Charlie only shook his head. "Numbers don't lie," he said, "but accountants do, and this accountant has said enough." The quiet end. A few weeks later, Charlie was found dead in his apartment. Officially, it was ruled a heart attack. Unofficially, few doubted the mob's hand in it. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, just a quiet end for a quiet man. The ledgers remained in government custody, and though they contributed to several indictments, the case against the syndicate collapsed without Charlie's testimony. The mob absorbed the losses and continued on, bruised but not broken. Charlie's name faded from the headlines quickly. He was, after all, just an accountant. The legacy of the clerk. In the years that followed, Charlie's story became a cautionary tale within law enforcement. Investigators learned that accountants were the true arteries of organized crime. They began targeting financial operatives more aggressively, understanding that every gangster's empire depended on someone to balance the books. For criminologists, Charlie represented the dilemma of complicity. He wasn't a gunman, yet his choices enabled violence, extortion, and corruption. He never pulled a trigger, but his ledgers funded those who did. And for the mob, his death was a reminder of their own paranoia. No one who knows too much can be trusted forever. Reflection. In the end, Charlie Winfield's crime was not just numbers on a page. It was the quiet betrayal of balance, using his skills not to protect, but to conceal, not to illuminate, but to obscure. The final question his story leaves is one of silence. Is it better to die with secrets intact, or to live by breaking them open? Every town has a postman. He is the figure who walks the same route every day, slipping letters through mail slots, whistling under his breath, nodding to neighbors. He is part of the background rhythm of life, unnoticed until he is absent. Mail carriers are trusted in a way few professions are. They handle love letters, tax refunds, bills, checks, passports. And in that trust lies temptation. This story is about a man who discovered just how much money passed quietly through envelopes, and how easy it was to deliver a fortune to himself. The perfect cover. His name was Frank Temple. For nearly 15 years, Frank worked as a postal carrier in a small coastal town in New England during the 1970s. He wore the uniform crisply, waved to children on bicycles, and kept a reputation as dependable. Rain or shine, he finished his route on time. Frank's life appeared modest. He lived in a rented apartment above a hardware store, drove an aging Ford, and ate most of his meals at the same diner. To his neighbors, he was reliable if a little dull. But behind the monotony, Frank had begun noticing patterns in the mail he carried. The flow of money. In the 1970s, the mail system was a lifeline of money. Paychecks arrived by post. Social Security checks were mailed monthly. Tax refunds came in envelopes from the Treasury. Even small-town businesses often sent cash in envelopes to suppliers or relatives. Frank saw it all. He knew which houses received government checks like clockwork, which businesses received envelopes thick with cash orders, which widows awaited pension payments. The knowledge was intoxicating. At first, he dismissed the temptation. A postman tampering with mail was a federal crime, punishable by years in prison. The Postal Service drilled into carriers the sanctity of the mail. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night, and certainly not theft. But temptation has a way of wearing down discipline, especially when opportunity repeats itself every morning. The first theft. It began with a single envelope, a Treasury check addressed to an elderly woman on Frank's route. He knew she was forgetful, often misplaced things. One day, with a flicker of hesitation, he slipped the envelope into his bag instead of her mailbox. That night, his heart pounded as he held the government check under his lamp. The amount was modest, under $200, but to Frank, it was more money than he'd had in his pocket in months. He forged the endorsement and cashed it at a liquor store in a neighboring town. No one noticed. The woman assumed the check was late. The government issued a replacement, and Frank, to his shock, realized he had pulled off the theft without consequence. The routine grows. After that, it became a pattern. A check here, a money order there. Frank was cautious, never taking too many from the same street, never drawing attention to a single victim. He staggered his thefts, spread them across months, and kept them small enough to avoid headlines. Over time, he grew bolder. He began targeting tax refunds, sometimes hundreds of dollars at a time. He learned to spot envelopes that contained cash by their weight and feel. He stole from businesses, families, even charities. The mail route became not just his job, but his hunting ground. The victims. For most victims, the losses were confusing rather than catastrophic. Elderly pensioners blamed delays. Businesses complained about slow mail service. Families filed for replacements. Because the system was large and bureaucratic, missing checks didn't immediately trigger suspicion of theft. But over time, complaints accumulated. The local post office received more and more reports of undelivered mail. Residents grumbled, but no one pointed a finger at Frank. He was their cheerful, reliable postman. Who would suspect him? The post office notices. The Postal Inspection Service, the federal agency responsible for investigating mail crimes, eventually noticed the pattern. Complaints from Frank's delivery area were higher than average. Government checks disappeared disproportionately along his route. Inspectors began discreet surveillance. They interviewed residents, checked replacement claim requests, and quietly followed Frank on his rounds. At first, they found nothing. Frank's habits were careful. He delivered most mail properly, kept to his schedule, and never carried stolen envelopes openly. But the inspectors were patient. They knew mail theft often took months to prove. Frank's greed. Frank, meanwhile, felt invincible. His modest apartment now contained hidden stacks of cash. He bought himself small luxuries, a new radio, nicer suits, occasional trips to the city. Nothing extravagant, but enough to feed his sense of success. He began to rationalize his crimes. The government would replace the checks, he told himself. No one was truly harmed. Most victims assumed the delays were bureaucratic errors. And wasn't he, after years of loyal service, entitled to a little more? It was a dangerous illusion, the kind that convinces criminals they are untouchable. The inspectors close in. One spring morning, postal inspectors prepared a test. They planted decoy envelopes containing marked bills and addressed them to homes along Frank's route. Each was disguised to look like an ordinary government check. Frank never saw the trap coming. When the inspectors reviewed his deliveries, one of the decoy envelopes never reached its address. Later that day, they found the marked bills tucked into his wallet. The quiet postman had been caught. The cliffhanger. As Section 1 closes, Frank faces the weight of federal charges. He had spent years delivering other people's fortunes into his own pockets. Now, the inspectors had proof, and the town would soon know the truth about their trusted mail carrier. The question that lingered was this: would Frank confess to years of theft, or insist it was only a single mistake? When Frank Temple was caught with the marked bills from the inspector's decoy envelope, his calm, dependable image collapsed. For years, he had carried himself as the embodiment of reliability, the postman who waved at children, who knew every porch and mailbox in town, who never once complained about the weather. But now, the inspectors had proof that the same man who carried love letters and bills had also stolen the lifelines of his neighbors. The quiet betrayal had to be traced back. How long had it been happening? And how many people had lost money they trusted him to deliver? The interrogation. After his arrest, Frank was taken to a small office inside the regional postal inspection headquarters. The inspectors, dressed in plain suits, sat across from him with a thin stack of papers, the evidence so far. They began simply. "You took the envelope," one said. Frank shrugged. "Just one, a mistake. I don't know why I did it." But the inspectors knew better. The planted test was rarely the first crime. It was the final confirmation. They pressed harder. They mentioned the pattern of complaints, the missing checks, the pensioners who never received their payments. Frank remained silent, staring at the table. He wouldn't admit to more. Not yet. The audit of the route. Meanwhile, investigators began a systematic review of his delivery area. They compared claims for missing checks against his route logs. They interviewed residents. They combed through years of complaints. The pattern became clearer than Frank realized. Government checks disappeared disproportionately along his path. Businesses had filed unusual numbers of missing money order claims. Elderly residents described months where their Social Security didn't arrive until replacements were issued. It was no longer about a single envelope. The theft stretched back years. The victims' stories. The victims' accounts painted a picture of quiet suffering. An elderly widow named Mrs. Callahan testified that she had gone without groceries for weeks because her pension check never came. She thought she had misplaced it and felt ashamed, never suspecting theft. A small-town grocer explained that a supplier payment had vanished, forcing him to borrow money at interest to keep his shelves stocked. He had blamed the postal system, never the man who handed him mail daily. A young mother recalled waiting for a tax refund that never arrived, delaying medical bills for her child. She cried as she explained she had once baked Frank a pie for Christmas, grateful for his service. Each story chipped away the illusion of harmlessness Frank had built for himself. Frank's denial. Despite the mounting evidence, Frank stuck to his story. He admitted only to the one envelope planted by inspectors. "I was tired, I slipped," he said. "That's all, just one." But prosecutors didn't need his confession. They had a pattern, they had the decoy test, and they had the victims. Piece by piece, they reconstructed his thefts, turning a quiet suspicion into a federal case. The scale of the theft. By the time investigators finished, the scope was staggering. Over the course of nearly a decade, Frank had stolen hundreds of checks and money orders. The total losses amounted to tens of thousands of dollars, a fortune for a man who earned a modest postal salary. It wasn't the size of the thefts individually, but their consistency that stunned investigators. Month after month, year after year, Frank had skimmed from his neighbors' lives, always small enough to avoid immediate detection, but in aggregate devastating. The town reacts. When the news broke, the town was shaken. Neighbors who had trusted Frank felt betrayed on a deeply personal level. Some expressed anger, others disbelief. "He carried my daughter's wedding invitations," one woman said, "and all that time he was stealing." Another remarked bitterly, "We used to wave at him every morning. Turns out he was waving with one hand and robbing us with the other." The betrayal cut deeper because Frank had been a fixture of trust. The uniform he wore symbolized federal reliability. Now, it symbolized violation. The inspector's strategy. Prosecutors faced the challenge of proving thefts beyond the decoy envelope. They relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, the pattern of complaints, the testimony of victims, and the improbability that so many losses occurred on one route without foul play. The inspectors also traced the forged endorsements on stolen checks. Handwriting experts matched several to Frank. Others were cashed at businesses near his apartment, often within days of the mail's scheduled delivery. Piece by piece, they built a picture too detailed to dismiss as coincidence. Frank's rationalizations. Privately, when questioned again, Frank began to rationalize. He claimed he never meant to hurt anyone, that the government always replaced missing checks, that his thefts were victimless. But prosecutors challenged him. Was the widow who went hungry victimless? The child who waited for medical care? The grocer forced into debt? Frank lowered his head. He had no answer. The trial begins. When Frank's case reached federal court, the gallery was filled with familiar faces. Neighbors who had waved at him on his route now watched him in silence. Victims testified tearfully. Inspectors laid out their careful investigation. Frank sat at the defense table in his plain suit, no longer a man in uniform, but a defendant accused of betraying his community. His lawyer argued that the government could only prove the one planted envelope, not the years of alleged theft. But the weight of testimony told another story, one of missing checks, vanished refunds, and a pattern that only pointed to him. The cliffhanger. As Section 2 ends, the trial hangs in the balance. The inspectors have built a convincing case, but Frank still clings to denial, insisting his guilt extends only to a single mistake. The question that remains is this: would the jury believe in years of quiet theft, or accept Frank's plea that he stumbled only once? When the trial of Frank Temple opened, it was more than a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning. For years, the townspeople had trusted him with their most private and essential lifelines, their wages, their benefits, their savings, their words. Now they sat in the gallery of a federal courtroom, waiting to see whether the man who carried their mail would also carry the burden of guilt. The jury listens. The prosecution laid out its case with steady precision. They showed the pattern of missing checks, the forgery evidence on endorsements, the trail of cashing locations that pointed back to Frank. They emphasized the sting operation, the planted envelope with marked bills, the undeniable proof that Frank had tampered with the mail. Victims testified one after another, their voices trembling with emotion. An elderly man explained how he had gone without medication when his pension check disappeared. A young mother described the humiliation of borrowing from relatives when her tax refund never arrived. The jurors listened in silence, faces tight with concentration. The weight of the betrayal was not abstract, it was human, personal, and close to home. The defense's argument. Frank's attorney tried to redirect the narrative. He conceded the planted envelope, but argued that the government had exaggerated the scale. This is a man who made one mistake after 15 years of service, the lawyer insisted. One error does not erase a career of reliability. The rest is speculation, built on coincidences and assumptions. He reminded the jury that not every missing check could be traced to Frank, that the postal system itself sometimes lost mail, and that bureaucratic delays were common. But the defense faced a difficult challenge. Frank's neighbors themselves had testified against him. These weren't strangers. These were people who had waved at him from their porches for years. Their pain made speculation harder to believe. Frank speaks. At last, Frank took the stand. His voice was quiet, almost timid. He admitted the planted envelope, calling it a moment of weakness. He swore he had never intended harm, that he had simply been desperate for money. "I loved my route," he said. "Those people, they trusted me. I never wanted to betray them." But when pressed on the pattern of losses, on the endorsements, on the cashing of checks near his apartment, his answers faltered. He denied what the evidence suggested, but each denial sounded weaker, less convincing. For the jury, his words rang hollow. The verdict. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom was hushed as the foreman stood. On charges of mail theft, forgery, and fraud, Frank Temple was found guilty. The decision reverberated through the gallery. Some nodded solemnly, others wept quietly. Frank sat motionless, his hands folded, his face pale. The man who once symbolized reliability was now convicted as a thief of trust. The sentence. The judge's words were measured but stern. "You carried more than envelopes, Mr. Temple. You carried the lifelines of this community, its wages, its pensions, its hopes. You had a duty not just to your employer but to every citizen on your route, and you betrayed them." Frank was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. It was not the harshest penalty possible, but for a man who had lived quietly and invisibly, it was a devastating fall. The community reacts. Back in town, reactions were mixed. Some expressed outrage that the sentence wasn't longer. 5 years for stealing our lives, one widow asked bitterly. Others felt pity, nodding that Frank had seemed lonely, isolated, and perhaps driven by desperation rather than greed. The Postal Service moved quickly to repair the breach. Replacement carriers were assigned, and inspectors met with residents to reassure them. But the damage lingered. People hesitated to trust again. Even simple envelopes were eyed with suspicion. The uniform that once symbolized reliability now carried the shadow of betrayal. The inspector's legacy. For the Postal Inspection Service, the case was a victory, proof that even trusted carriers were not beyond scrutiny. They used the case to tighten procedures. More audits of routes, stricter monitoring of complaints, better systems to track missing checks. Frank's story was retold in inspector training for years. The cautionary tale of how long a postman could get away with theft before being caught, and how deeply it hurt when he was. Frank in prison. Inside prison, Frank was no celebrity. He was not a gangster, not a mastermind. He was simply the postman, a man who had traded trust for envelopes of cash. Inmates mocked him for stealing checks from widows and pensioners. He kept to himself, working in the prison library, quietly serving his time. He never spoke much about the thefts, never offered deeper explanations. To some, his silence was cowardice. To others, it was shame. The long-term consequences. The victims carried the weight far longer than Frank did. Some never recovered financially. Others carried the bitterness to their graves. For the town, the case became a story parents told children, a warning that trust should never be blind. For the Postal Service, it was a reminder that even the most ordinary jobs carried extraordinary responsibility. And for criminologists, Frank's story highlighted the dangers of quiet crime thefts that leave no broken windows, no smashed doors, only missing pieces of trust. Reflection. In the end, Frank Temple's crime was not about money. The government replaced the checks, the banks reimbursed some losses, the figures balanced eventually, but the trust did not. What he stole was something harder to replace. The sense that your postman, the man who carried your letters, was above suspicion. The final question left in the air was simple but unsettling. If we cannot trust the man who delivers our mail, who can we trust? Hotels have always carried an aura of anonymity. A stranger checks in, pays for a room, stays a night or two, and disappears without a trace. For the guest, the hotel promises privacy. For the owner, it promises steady business. But for one hotelier in the American Midwest during the 1930s, the promise was twisted into something else. A scheme of quiet exploitation that left guests wondering whether their rooms were ever truly theirs. The man behind the desk. His name was Walter Harlan, though most simply called him Mr. Harlan. He owned a modest boarding hotel near the railway station in a mid-sized industrial town. The building wasn't glamorous, a squat brick structure with faded carpets and a creaking staircase, but it served a purpose. Salesmen, traveling laborers, and the occasional family on the move all passed through its doors. Harlan himself projected respectability. He wore pressed suits, spoke with politeness, and kept a ledger of guests with meticulous care. He was always seen behind the reception desk, pen in hand, as though the hotel were not just his business but his very identity. To locals, Harlan was a fixture, dull, dependable, and harmless. The temptation of vacancy. But running a hotel in the Depression years was no easy business. Guests came and went unpredictably. Rooms often sat empty for weeks. Money was scarce, and owners had to scrape every dollar to survive. It was in this atmosphere of financial desperation that Harlan discovered a peculiar opportunity, renting the same room to more than one guest. At first, it happened by accident. A traveling salesman failed to show up one evening, but Harlan had already promised the room to another. Rather than turn away the second guest, he quietly gave them the same key, assuming the salesman's absence would go unnoticed. It worked. The salesman never arrived, the second guest paid in cash, and Harlan pocketed double profit for a single room. The risk seemed low, the temptation irresistible. The scheme expands. Soon, Harlan began engineering the situation deliberately. He identified which guests were unlikely to complain, laborers too exhausted to notice details, travelers staying only one night, drifters with no fixed addresses. He would quietly rent out their rooms again, sometimes to late-night arrivals willing to pay a premium. To avoid suspicion, he developed a system. He gave duplicate keys, assuring each guest they were the only occupant. He staggered check-in and check-out times, ensuring guests rarely crossed paths. He kept the ledger altered, with certain names erased or never written at all. The scheme was risky but profitable. In lean years, it kept his business afloat. The guests notice. But rooms are intimate places. Guests began to notice signs that something was off: a suitcase disturbed, a bed slightly rumpled, a drawer open that they were sure they had closed. One salesman complained that the water in his pitcher had been half drained overnight. Another swore his sample case had been moved across the room. Still, these were minor inconveniences, easily brushed off as memory lapses or accidents by housekeeping. Only later, when patterns emerged, did they realize the truth. They had not been alone in their rooms. The rumor spreads. By the mid-1930s, whispers spread among traveling salesmen and laborers who passed through town. Some called Harlan's hotel the double booking house. Others warned newcomers not to leave valuables unattended. Local merchants heard stories of men waking to find strangers unlocking their doors, of guests discovering their belongings tampered with. And yet, because many travelers were transient, complaints rarely stuck. By the time suspicion was raised, the guests were already gone, moving on to the next town. The first real complaint. It wasn't until a traveling minister filed a formal complaint that authorities paid attention. He claimed that upon returning to his room late one night, he found another man already sleeping in his bed, drunk, who insisted the room was his. Both carried identical keys. The minister raised the issue with police, who visited the hotel. Harlan, calm as always, insisted it was a clerical error. 2 reservations had been mistakenly assigned the same key. The drunk, he said, must have stumbled into the wrong room. The police accepted his explanation, but the rumor lingered. Harlan's errors happened too often to be accidents. The investigators' interest. Eventually, state regulators began noticing complaints about Harlan's establishment. Traveling salesmen unions filed grievances. The local newspaper ran a quiet editorial about the dubious hospitality near the station. Investigators decided to take a closer look, but proving the scheme wasn't easy. Hotels dealt with errors all the time. Keys were sometimes misassigned, ledgers messy, guests unreliable in memory. To build a case, investigators would need more than anecdotes. The cliffhanger. By the end of Section 1, Harlan remained behind his desk, calmly taking payments, handing out keys, and jotting names in his ledger. Guests still checked in. Some left satisfied, others left unsettled. The town wondered, was Harlan merely careless with his records, or was he deliberately selling the same night's rest twice? The truth was about to come out, but not before more guests discovered that privacy in Harlan's hotel was an illusion. Walter Harlan had built his reputation on being steady, predictable, and polite. But beneath the calm veneer of the man behind the desk, his hotel had become something stranger, a place where privacy was rented in duplicate, and where guests awoke uneasy, not knowing if their room was truly theirs. By the late 1930s, the whispers were too loud to ignore. Salesmen's associations passed warnings. Laborers muttered about missing coins from their pockets. Families avoided the hotel altogether. For investigators, the question became clear. Were these rumors the result of sloppy management or deliberate fraud? The investigators returned. This time, investigators came prepared. Rather than wait for complaints, they staged their own. 2 plainclothes inspectors, posing as traveling salesmen, checked into Harlan's hotel on the same night. One registered under his real name, the other under an alias, both paying in cash. The inspectors compared notes. They found subtle oddities. Their receipts lacked dates. Their room assignments were scratched into the ledger in faint pencil, not ink. And when one asked for a spare key, Harlan produced it quickly, as though duplicates were already waiting. It was enough to confirm suspicion. The investigators requested a full copy of the guest ledger, a demand that Harlan resisted fiercely. Private business records, he insisted. No obligation. But under pressure, he relented. What the inspectors found was astonishing. Names repeated across weeks, but with no checkout times recorded. Entire columns were erased and rewritten. In some cases, 2 payments were listed for the same room on the same night. The evidence suggested more than accidents, it suggested intent. The guests speak. Once word spread that investigators were involved, former guests began to step forward. One salesman recalled returning late to his room to find his suitcase rifled through, though nothing was stolen. A railroad worker swore he had awakened to the sound of a key in his lock, only to see another man enter, equally startled. A local couple, traveling home after visiting relatives, said they had cut their stay short when they realized strangers seemed to know which room they occupied. Each story added weight to the suspicion that Harlan was running more than a careless hotel. He was selling the same space twice and trusting his ability to smooth over the conflicts. Harlan's denials. When confronted, Harlan remained calm. He claimed clerical errors, blamed exhausted staff, and insisted he had been overwhelmed during busy seasons. "These are accidents," he told reporters. "Every hotel makes mistakes. Sometimes two reservations overlap. Sometimes a guest doesn't check out properly. That's all." But the inspectors noticed something crucial. Harlan had no staff. He ran the front desk himself, managed the ledgers personally, and handled the keys alone. There was no one else to blame. The angry salesmen. The real pressure came from traveling salesmen's associations. In the 1930s, these groups wielded significant influence. Their members relied on reliable lodging, and they resented establishments that cheated them. Word of Harlan's practices spread through newsletters and word of mouth. Salesmen began boycotting his hotel, warning one another to avoid the double-booking house. Some even filed collective complaints, arguing that Harlan's scheme endangered not just property, but personal safety. The boycott hit Harlan where it hurt most: his income. But instead of abandoning the scheme, he doubled down, growing bolder in pursuit of dwindling profits. The false lock trick. Investigators discovered that Harlan had begun using a trick to cover his tracks: false locks. He kept multiple copies of keys, and in some cases, replaced locks with ones he could reset easily. Guests thought they had private rooms, but Harlan could grant access to others at will. The trick explained why so many guests reported subtle disturbances: a drawer open, a suitcase moved. Their rooms were not private sanctuaries, but shared spaces rotated for profit. The more investigators dug, the more it became clear. This was not incompetence. It was a deliberate pattern of deception. The tipping point. The tipping point came when a traveling minister once again became a central figure. This time, it was not just a duplicate key, but a near-violent confrontation. Late one night, the minister returned to his room to find a stranger inside, a drunk who had also paid for the same space. Both men shouted, accusing each other of trespassing. The confrontation nearly turned into a fight before neighbors intervened. Police were called, and this time, the excuse of clerical error rang hollow. With inspectors already investigating and multiple complaints filed, Harlan's credibility collapsed. Building the case. The state attorney's office reviewed the evidence. Ledgers with overlapping entries. Testimony from multiple guests. Evidence of duplicate keys and altered locks. They concluded that Harlan's scheme was deliberate fraud, not accident. By renting rooms twice, he had defrauded customers, endangered their safety, and violated licensing laws. Charges were filed: fraud, false business records, and endangerment. Harlan's strategy. Harlan, ever composed, prepared his defense. He hired a modest lawyer and planned to argue that the accusations were exaggerated. He would claim his bookkeeping was sloppy, that guests were unreliable, and that inspectors had misinterpreted ordinary errors. But as the complaints piled up and inspectors revealed more about his false lock trick, his strategy looked weaker by the day. The cliffhanger. As Section 2 closes, Harlan faces trial. The townspeople, salesmen, and inspectors are eager to see justice served. But Harlan still insists he is the victim of misunderstanding, that his hotel is guilty only of occasional errors. The looming question remains: would the jury believe Harlan's story of incompetence, or see through to the scheme of a man who sold the same night's rest twice? The trial of Walter Harlan drew little attention from the national press. There were no gangsters, no murders, no sensational headlines. But in the town where his hotel stood, the courtroom was packed. Traveling salesmen, laborers, and townsfolk crowded the benches, eager to see whether the man behind the desk would finally be held accountable for years of quiet deception. The prosecution's case. The state's attorney laid out the pattern with methodical precision. Ledgers, pages with erased names, double entries for the same room, and payments that overlapped. Keys, multiple duplicates for rooms that should have had only one. Guest testimonies. Salesmen, laborers, and the minister himself described the unsettling moments when their supposed private rooms became unexpectedly public. The prosecution argued that Harlan's scheme was deliberate. By exploiting guests' trust, he pocketed profits while exposing them to theft, danger, and humiliation. This was not incompetence, the prosecutor said firmly. This was fraud dressed as hospitality. The defense. Harlan's attorney countered with appeals to doubt. He insisted that hotels often experienced clerical mistakes, that ledgers were messy by nature, and that travelers were unreliable witnesses after long days of drinking or fatigue. These are exaggerations, he argued. Mr. Harlan is guilty only of poor record-keeping, nothing more. He reminded jurors that Harlan had never physically harmed anyone, never stolen from rooms himself. At worst, the lawyer said, he is careless. That is not a crime. Harlan testifies. When Harlan took the stand, he wore his usual pressed suit, his hair slicked back, his demeanor calm. He spoke politely, as though he were still behind the hotel desk. I did my best, he said. I ran that hotel alone, mistakes happened, guests confused rooms, sometimes I misplaced entries, but I never meant harm. Under cross-examination, however, cracks appeared. Why did his ledgers show 2 payments for the same room on the same night? Why did he keep multiple keys? Why had so many guests described similar disturbances? Harlan stammered, grew defensive, and finally repeated, mistakes, only mistakes. The jurors exchanged skeptical glances. The verdict. After only a day of deliberation, the jury returned. Walter Harlan was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and false business records. The sentence was modest by modern standards, 18 months in state prison and the revocation of his hotel license. But for Harlan, it was devastating. His business was shuttered, his reputation destroyed, his name permanently linked to deception. The community reacts. The verdict divided opinion. Some townspeople felt justice was done. He made fools of us all, one salesman said bitterly. We trusted him with our money, our safety, and he sold it twice. Others saw Harlan as a desperate man in desperate times. It was the Depression, one neighbor reminded reporters. He was trying to survive. He wasn't violent, he wasn't a killer, he just cheated. But for travelers, the damage was lasting. Many avoided the town altogether, unwilling to risk another betrayal. The once busy hotel sat empty, its windows dark, a reminder of how quickly trust could crumble. Broader lessons. The case made its way into discussions among hotel associations and regulators. It highlighted the need for oversight, standardized booking practices, and stricter licensing requirements. Hospitality schools later cited Harlan's scheme as an example of how small frauds could spiral into industry-wide distrust. More broadly, criminologists used the case to illustrate quiet fraud crimes that lack violence but corrode social trust. A room is supposed to be private. When that promise is broken, the violation lingers long after the money is gone. Harlan's life after. After serving his sentence, Walter Harlan disappeared from public life. He never reopened a hotel, never returned to the front desk where he had once spent every day. Some said he moved west, living under a different name. Others claimed he worked as a clerk in a distant city. His old hotel remained abandoned for years before it was finally torn down. Locals still called it the Double Booking House, until the day the bricks fell. Reflection. In the end, Harlan's crime was not spectacular. He did not rob banks or fire guns. He simply sold the same promise twice, the promise of privacy, of rest, of safety. His story leaves us with a question. when the walls meant to protect us are sold to another, is the crime in the profit, or in the betrayal of trust itself? When most people imagine crime, they picture dark alleys, city streets, or the hidden corners of industry. Few think of cornfields stretching under an endless sky, of barns filled with the scent of hay, of farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys. Yet even in the quietest places, where life seems tied to soil and seasons, crime can take root. This is the story of a farmer whose harvest included more than what grew in his fields, and how the illusion of honest labor concealed something far more profitable and far more dangerous. The man of the fields. His name was Raymond Pike, though in town people simply called him Ray. He owned a modest farm on the edge of a Midwestern county, not far from the river. The land had been in his family for 2 generations, though by the 1940s the soil had grown tired, the yield smaller each year. Ray was a quiet man. He kept to himself, worked his land with steady patience, and sold his corn and beans at the market. He wasn't wealthy, but neither was he destitute. He gave the impression of someone who had accepted a life of modest means. Neighbors described him as dependable if a little withdrawn. He didn't gossip at church socials. He didn't linger at the diner. He minded his fields, his livestock, and little else. At least that's what everyone thought. The hidden harvest. During Prohibition in the 1920s, many farmers in the region had discovered an extra crop, corn not just for food, but for liquor. Bootleggers paid handsomely for corn that could be distilled into moonshine. Even after Prohibition ended in 1933, the trade lingered in rural pockets, where unlicensed stills offered liquor cheaper than taxed bottles in town. Ray inherited not only his land but also his father's secret still. Hidden in the far corner of the barn behind stacked hay bales, the still remained functional. For years, Ray ignored it, focusing on legitimate crops. But as his debts mounted and his yields dwindled, temptation grew. By the early 1940s, Ray was no longer just a farmer. He was a supplier. The double life. Ray's routine was deceptively ordinary. By day, he tended his crops, repaired fences, and drove his produce into town. By night, under the cover of crickets and wind, he distilled corn mash into strong, clear liquor. The bottles, unlabeled and anonymous, went quietly into the hands of buyers who paid in cash. The buyers were not just thirsty neighbors. They were part of a small but organized network that distributed unlicensed alcohol across county lines. Taverns, truck stops, and even city bars stocked their shelves with Ray's liquor, disguised in legitimate bottles. For Ray, the money was transformative. He paid off debts, bought new equipment, and quietly expanded his acreage. To townsfolk, it seemed he had simply worked harder than most. Few suspected the truth. The first suspicion. Suspicion began when federal tax agents noticed discrepancies in liquor sales across the region. Taverns reported volumes that exceeded their licensed purchases. Someone, somewhere, was supplying them off the books. Agents began tracing bottles, interviewing tavern owners, and following delivery trucks. Though they didn't yet know Ray's name, they knew the supply chain started in the countryside. Meanwhile, neighbors noticed oddities: trucks arriving at Ray's farm late at night, strangers lingering at the edge of his property, the faint smell of mash drifting from his barn on still evenings. Whispers began: Ray's harvest isn't just corn. The local sheriff. The local sheriff, Harold McCready, heard the whispers but dismissed them at first. Ray was quiet, reliable, never caused trouble. Compared to bootleggers who ran guns and fought turf wars, Ray seemed harmless. But when federal agents arrived in town, Sheriff McCready realized the matter wasn't going away. They suspected a still, and they wanted his cooperation. McCready faced a dilemma. Protecting a local farmer was one thing, obstructing federal law was another. Reluctantly, he agreed to keep an eye on Ray. A visit to the farm. One afternoon, McCready paid Ray a friendly visit. He leaned against the fence, tipped his hat, and asked casual questions about the farm. Ray answered politely, his eyes steady, his words calm. Nothing seemed out of place. But as McCready walked back toward his car, he caught a faint whiff on the breeze, a sharp, yeasty smell he recognized from Prohibition days. The scent of corn mash. He didn't say anything then, but he reported it to the federal agents. The investigators' plan. The agents devised a plan. They would send an undercover buyer to Ray's farm, posing as a tavern owner looking for cheap liquor. If Ray sold, they would have their proof. The buyer arrived one evening in an old truck, asking for directions first to test Ray's caution. Ray hesitated, studied the stranger, then finally gestured toward the barn. Minutes later, the buyer left with a crate of unlabeled bottles. The trap was set. The cliffhanger. By the end of Section 1, Ray's quiet double life was on the verge of exposure. He had harvested not just corn but cash from an illegal still. For years, he balanced respectability with secrecy. But now, federal eyes were on him, and his careful routine was unraveling. The question was clear. Would Ray be remembered as a farmer who worked his fields, or as a bootlegger who harvested crime alongside his crops? For years, Raymond Pike had hidden his second livelihood under the cover of ordinary farming. His neighbors saw him tending cornfields, mending fences, and hauling feed. What they didn't see was the hidden still in his barn, where every night the quiet farmer distilled liquor strong enough to make tavern owners pay in cash. But now, with federal agents watching and an undercover buyer carrying bottles out of his barn, Ray's secret harvest was no longer his alone. The undercover purchase. The undercover buyer who visited Ray's farm left with a wooden crate of unmarked bottles, the liquid inside clear as water but biting as fire. The transaction was simple, no paperwork, no pretense, just cash for liquor. Federal agents photographed the crate, tested the contents in their lab, and confirmed what they already suspected. High-proof corn whiskey, untaxed and unlicensed. One purchase wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to justify further surveillance. The agents prepared for a longer operation. Neighbors' stories. Meanwhile, neighbors who once dismissed whispers about Ray began sharing their observations. One farmer said he had noticed trucks pulling into Ray's property late at night, engines off, headlights dimmed. A farmhand swore he had once seen barrels being rolled into the barn, far too heavy for grain. A local boy recalled sneaking near the property and hearing the hiss and drip of liquid long after sundown. The picture grew sharper. Ray's barn was no ordinary farm building. Sheriff McCready's unease. Sheriff Harold McCready found himself caught in the middle. On one hand, Ray was a local man, a quiet figure who had never caused trouble. On the other, the evidence was stacking up. McCready visited Ray again, this time with sterner questions. "Folks are talking," he said. "You got something in that barn you want to tell me about?" Ray's eyes flickered just for a moment before he shook his head. "Just corn, Sheriff, always has been." The denial was calm, but McCready left uneasy. He had smelled the mash once, and now he could not ignore it. The expanding operation. Federal agents stepped up their surveillance. They stationed cars at the edge of the county road, binoculars trained on Ray's property. They tracked the trucks that came and went, following them to taverns and roadside stops across state lines. Each lead confirmed the same thing. Ray's liquor was moving far beyond the county. What began as a desperate farmer's side business had grown into a small distribution network. The agents began drafting affidavits for a search warrant. Ray's rationalization. Inside his farmhouse, Ray tried to quiet his conscience. He told himself he wasn't hurting anyone. His liquor was cheaper than taxed bottles, his buyers willing. During hard years, his still had saved his land from foreclosure. But beneath the rationalization was fear. He noticed unfamiliar cars parked along the road, strangers at the diner watching him too closely. He checked his barn locks twice each night, as if he knew they would not hold forever. The sting operation. The final step came when federal agents staged a sting. They sent the undercover buyer back, this time requesting a larger order, several crates. Ray hesitated. The order was bigger than usual, the stranger too eager. But the money was good and he had grown accustomed to risk. He agreed. As the crates were loaded into the truck, federal agents swooped in. Cars rolled up the driveway, headlights blazing. Agents leapt out with warrants and flashlights. Ray froze, his hand still on the crate. His secret barn was no longer hidden. The search. Inside the barn, agents found exactly what they expected. The copper still, barrels of mash, crates of bottled liquor, and ledgers tracking sales in neat handwriting. The ledgers were damning. They showed not just production but distribution names of taverns, amounts delivered, payments collected. Ray had recorded everything, as methodical in his crime as he was in his farming. One agent remarked, he farmed numbers as carefully as corn. The arrest. Ray was arrested on charges of operating an unlicensed still, tax evasion, and illegal distribution of alcohol. His farm, once a symbol of quiet respectability, was swarmed with federal officers. Neighbors stood at their fences, watching silently as the man they had known for decades was led away in handcuffs. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered that they had always suspected. A few expressed pity not for the crime, but for the farmer whose debts had driven him to harvest more than crops. The trial approaches. As news spread, tavern owners scrambled. Some denied ever buying from Ray, others claimed ignorance. Federal prosecutors, however, had his ledgers, his liquor, and their own undercover purchases. The case against him was strong, but in rural towns where farmers were respected, jurors might not see him as a criminal, but as a man who bent rules to survive. Would sympathy outweigh evidence? The cliffhanger. By the end of Section 2, Ray's barn stood empty, his still dismantled, his reputation unraveling. The trial loomed, and the community wrestled with how to judge a man who had harvested not only corn, but cash from illegal liquor. The question remained. Would Ray be punished as a criminal bootlegger, or pitied as a desperate farmer caught between soil and survival? When Raymond Pike was led into the county courthouse, he no longer looked like a farmer. Gone were the worn boots and rolled sleeves, replaced by a plain suit borrowed from his brother-in-law. His hands, once stained with soil and grease, were folded tightly as he sat at the defense table. For years, Ray had lived quietly, his reputation unblemished. But now, with federal charges laid against him, the question before the jury was simple. Was he a desperate farmer trying to survive, or a criminal who had built an illicit business from corn and secrecy? The prosecution's case. The federal prosecutor wasted no time. He laid the evidence bare. The still, photographs of the copper equipment, the barrels of mash, the coils and tubing hidden behind hay bales. The liquor, crates of clear bottles, seized from the barn and tested in the lab. The ledgers, neatly written records of sales, complete with dates, quantities, and payments. This was no accident, the prosecutor told the jury. This was not a farmer dabbling with an old family recipe. This was a deliberate operation designed to avoid taxes, to profit illegally, and to flood taverns with unlicensed liquor. Witnesses followed. Tavern owners who, under pressure, admitted to buying bottles from Ray. Agents who testified about the undercover purchase. Sheriff McCready, who described the smell of mash drifting from the barn. Piece by piece, the picture grew undeniable. The defense. Ray's lawyer, a local man with more experience in property disputes than federal trials, did his best to reframe the story. He argued that Ray was not a criminal mastermind but a struggling farmer. Yes, he had a still, the lawyer admitted, but he did not run a syndicate. He did not harm anyone. He was a man trying to keep his land when the soil failed him. The lawyer reminded jurors of the Depression years, when many families had bent rules to survive. He painted Ray as a man who had chosen wrongly, but not wickedly. He is guilty of desperation, the lawyer said, not of malice. Ray's testimony. When Ray took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He spoke plainly, in the same voice neighbors had heard at the market and church suppers. I didn't set out to break the law, he said. But when the crops failed and the bank came calling, I didn't see another way. The still was already there, my father's from years back. I told myself it was temporary, but the money came steady and I kept at it. He admitted to making and selling liquor, but insisted he never saw himself as a bootlegger. I was still a farmer, he said, just one who harvested a little extra. The jury listened, some with sympathy, others with skepticism. The verdict. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood, his expression solemn. On charges of operating an unlicensed still and tax evasion, Raymond Pike was found guilty. The courtroom murmured, half expecting the verdict, half hoping for acquittal. Ray bowed his head, accepting the decision quietly. The sentence. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged Ray's circumstances. You were not a gangster, he said. You were not violent, but you broke the law deliberately, and you profited by deceiving both your neighbors and your government. Ray was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, along with fines for unpaid taxes. His farm was seized temporarily to cover debts. For a man who had rarely left his county, prison was another world entirely. The community's reaction. In town, opinions remained divided. Some condemned Ray outright. He cheated us all, one merchant said. While we worked honest, he lined his pockets with liquor money. Others defended him. The banks were cruel, a neighbor insisted. If you'd watched your land fail year after year, you might have done the same. The story revealed less about Ray himself than about the community's values. How far one could bend the law before sympathy turned to judgment. Ray in prison. In prison, Ray was no celebrity. He was simply another inmate, a farmer among thieves. He worked in the prison kitchen, kept his head down, and counted the days until release. He wrote letters to his sister, who cared for his farm in his absence. In them, he expressed regret, not so much for the crime, but for losing the land his family had held for generations. The corn will grow without me, he wrote once, but the trust won't. The aftermath. When Ray was released, the world had moved on. His farm had been leased to another family, his equipment sold, his reputation faded. He found work as a hired hand, no longer the man who owned land, but the man who worked it for others. He lived quietly until his death, rarely speaking of the still, though neighbors never forgot. For decades, children in the county whispered about the farmer who harvested more than corn.